Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laif Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. Remember the language we're learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase, a cyclic rhythm defined at every point in the universe. Its first derivatives give three simultaneous echoes: time, omega, space, k, and motion, v, built from both. Above them, higher derivatives form a branching tree that, in principle, goes on forever. Every law of nature is a pattern in this tree of derivatives of phi. Today, we do something special. We stop zooming into one branch, and we step back far enough to see the whole climb at once. Episode 6, Episode 7, Episode 8, and now Episode 9. This is part 1 of Episode 9, and it is a transition. It is the moment where the listener is allowed to breathe, to look behind, and to recognize how much has already been built. Because Episode 9 is where the language stops being only a vision and starts becoming a method. Episode 9 is where the master tree becomes not only a map of meaning, but a discipline of measurement, reconstruction, and falsification. Before we can do that honestly, we must gather our journey into one coherent picture, so nothing is missing and nothing is confused. So let me tell you the whole story as one story. Imagine the universe as a single woven tapestry. And imagine that the thread is not matter or energy as a separate substance, but a cyclic order, phi. This is not poetry as decoration. It is a rigorous kind of imagination, the way a good diagram is imagination made disciplined. In a woven rug, you do not need a different substance for every color and pattern. You need one thread and rules for how it is knotted, crossed, tightened, loosened, repeated, and layered. In Holophase, phi is that one thread. The derivatives are the rules of knotting and weaving. The visible world is the emergent pattern. Episode 6 was where we walked up to the loom for the first time. We started with a simple pain that every honest thinker has felt. The feeling that physics is a magnificent dictionary with too many independent entries. Many particles, many fields, many constants, many special cases. Even our greatest successes sometimes feel like a patched handbook rather than one grammar. Holophase begins as a question. What if the unity we keep searching for is not another ingredient, but a language? What if reality is written? Then episode 6 introduced the silent root, phi, a cyclic order at every point. Like the hand of a clock, always defined, always turning, but never meaningful in its absolute position. And here came our first discipline, shift symmetry. Add a constant to phi everywhere and nothing observable changes. The melody is in the intervals, not the absolute pitch. The landscape is in slopes, not absolute altitude. This is the first deep lesson Holophase asks you to carry. Reality is relational. What matters is difference, not absolute value. From that one discipline, the language awakened. Episode 6 revealed the first great miracle of the Holophase tree. The moment phi is allowed to change, three dimensions appear at once, not as separate containers, but as three readings of one underlying change. The temporal echo is omega, how fast phi turns along the sequence we call time. The spatial echo is k, how phi twists across coexistence, the spread we call space. And the motion echo is v, not an independent ingredient, but a relationship between omega and k, a rule that answers a very human question. How fast must I move to stay on the same phase crest? The surfer does not invent the ocean. The surfer follows a crest. In holophase, motion is phase following. At the same first level we met dphi, the unified change. Instead of thinking time change and space change as separate kinds of change, dphi says change is one thing. You can slice it in different directions. You can step only along time and read omega, only along space and read k, or along any mixed path and read the total response. This is where the language quietly prepares the listener for a deeper truth. Time and space are not two independent substances. They are two projections of a single, more primary process. Episode 6 then did what every real language lesson must do. It went beyond letters and began grammar. Second derivatives entered as accents. If omega is the tempo, then alpha is the change of tempo, the acceleration of the ticking rate. If k is the weave density, then curvature and convergence tell you whether the pattern bends, focuses, spreads, or pinches. The hill analogy was important here. Slope is a first derivative, but curvature is what tells you whether you are on a bowl, a ridge, or a flat plane. This is where the listener begins to see how forces can be read as grammatical consequences of shape, not as mysterious extra pushes. Episode 6 then raised the horizon. The language does not stop at one or two derivative layers. In principle, it climbs forever. At every point, there is an infinite dictionary, J infinity phi, the jet, phi and all its derivatives at all orders. This is the idea that if you know the full derivative profile at a point, you know how the field behaves nearby with arbitrary precision. It is like describing a curve not only by its position and slope, but by every derivative that determines its full local shape. And then episode 6 opened the topological door, and this door changes everything. Because phi is cyclic, its values live on a circle. That means you can walk around the loop and count how many full turns phi makes. You get an integer. This integer cannot be erased by gentle smoothing. It is a discrete skeleton inside a continuous language. This is winding. This is the birth of digital meaning inside analog structure. And alongside winding came sigma, the defect set, the places where the phase cannot be made smooth. Here the language explained how particles can be knots rather than substances, stable grammatical forms rather than foreign ingredients. Episode 6 ended by daring you to translate daily life. Light as phi patterns with particular omega and k relations. Sound as phi patterns in elastic media. Objects as long-lived configurations of stable derivative fingerprints. Even thought as a nested, high-order, extremely complex phi phrase realized in neural dynamics. The point was not to be mystical. The point was to break the habit of thinking the world is made of unrelated categories and to train a new habit. Everything is a sentence in one language. Then episode 7 began, and episode 7 was not simply more content. Episode 7 was literacy. Episode 6 taught you letters. Episode 7 taught you to read identity, stability, and meaning in the language. Episode 7 brought a crucial shift. A thing is not a lump. A thing is a stable pattern. Identity is not a name. Identity is a fingerprint in the derivative tree. And episode 7 taught that identity is triunified, because the language is triunified. Temporal identity is the recognizable rhythm of a pattern through time. It is not frozen sameness. A song remains itself even if played with slight rubato. A heartbeat remains a heartbeat even if it speeds up. In holophase, that corresponds to a stable temporal signature in omega, alpha, and the higher temporal ladder. Spatial identity is the recognizable shape of a pattern in space. A droplet stays a droplet because the curvature and gradient fingerprint persists. A crystal stays a crystal because the spatial derivative pattern locks into stability. Spatial identity is not only location, it is the structure of K, curvature, convergence, shear, twist, and whatever order of detail you need. Motion identity is the recognizable way a pattern carries itself. A comet is partly its orbit. A soliton is partly its speed while keeping its form. A wave packet is partly its group velocity and its deformation rule. Motion identity is the kinematic handwriting of V, and the higher kinematic nuances that refine it. Episode 7 then revealed the core philosophical discipline behind this. Dimensions are meaning. Time is not just a background clock. It is the tempo structure omega and its tower. Space is not an empty box. It is the pattern structure K and its tower. Motion is not an independent ingredient. It is the transformation relationship V built from the other two. This is what we call dimensional semanticity. Time, space, and motion are semantic projections of phi structure. Then episode 7 delivered the idea that reorganizes the whole tree, the dimensional echo. The naive beginner thinks omega equals time, k equals space, v equals motion, and now we're done. But Holophase says every derivative at every order casts 3 shadows. Curvature has a temporal echo, a spatial echo, and a motion echo. Topology has a temporal life, a spatial shape, and a motion trajectory. Waves have temporal rhythm, spatial profile, and propagation law. There is no dimension where the language stops echoing, because the language is one continuous field changing in one continuous reality. Episode 7 also made the infinite usable by teaching compression. The tree is infinite in principle, but phenomena speak finite dialects. Most of what we measure in daily physics lives in low orders. The infinite canopy is a guarantee of depth, not a demand that you calculate everything. Like language, you do not need every possible sentence to speak meaningfully. You need a workable subset. Holophase gives you an organized ladder for refinement, so you can improve description systematically. And episode 7 kept the scientific spine alive: falsifiability. If motion is derived from omega and k, experiments on wave propagation must reflect that relationship. If topological charges exist as winding numbers, they must be stable and countable in real systems. If balances like omega squared and k squared are meaningful intensity measures, then the way systems stabilize and optimize should show those patterns. Literacy in Holophase includes learning what would prove you wrong. Then episode 8 arrived, and episode 8 was the moment we stepped into the Platonic realm, the place where we define the language before the world is printed in it. This mattered because without that purification, the language stays too dependent on physical intuition, and physical intuition can hide mistakes. Episode 8 said, "Let us define the Holophase language as pure structure." So episode 8 clarified the difference between a language and a story. A language is the space of possible sentences. A universe is one particular story printed in that language. Holophase begins, abstractly, as phi defined on a manifold into a circle, and its entire infinite derivative hierarchy above it. No particles, no forces, no medium yet. Only the script and its rules. Episode 8 purified the alphabet. The derivatives are not yet frequency or wavelength. They are purely the answers to questions about change. First order is the basic alphabet. Second order is nuance. Higher orders are refinements. Mixed derivatives are cross letters that weave sequence and coexistence into one syntax. The jet J Feminito Faya is the complete local dictionary. Episode 8 purified grammar. Not every bundle of derivative values comes from a real phi. Integrability is the existence test. Constraint identities are syntax rules. Closure under differentiation is the reason the language never needs a second substrate. You can always ask a finer question and remain inside the same script. This is where Holophase becomes mathematically disciplined in the simplest sense. It becomes a well-defined object, not a mood. Episode 8 then rebuilt topology inside the abstract language itself. Sigma as the boundary where smoothness fails. Winding as the discrete core. Braids and links as complex word forms. Holonomy as path-dependent semantic memory. This is where the language gains the capacity to encode records of motion without adding external labels. Episode 8 then rebuilt semantics without reference. Meaning as invariant structure, not as attached names. It rebuilt triunity as three projections: sequence, coexistence, transformation. It rebuilt intensity as quadratic forms, omega squared and k squared, as measures of change without prematurely calling them energy. It rebuilt action as an abstract optimality score, a principle that selects sentences by economy, again without committing yet to a specific physical implementation. Episode 8 then opened information. Information as constraint and predictability. Memory as persistence and hysteresis. Complexity as depth in the derivative hierarchy. Computation as possible because the language is generative and compositional. It also added humility. The language can be rich without promising that a finite book captures every truth. Self-reference and limits exist. The project remains rigorous by admitting them. Then episode 8 turned toward what will matter most in episode 9: representation freedom, canonical form, and equivalence. If a language is real, then the same meaning can be written in different ways. You can change coordinates, you can reparameterize, you can apply symmetry transformations, you can rewrite expressions without changing invariant content. That means the sentence is not the ink. The sentence is the equivalence class of expressions under the allowed symmetry group. This is essential because otherwise we confuse form with meaning and we mistake a change of notation for a change of reality. So episode 8 introduced the need for a Holophase language standard, HLS, a canonical normal form. Among all equivalent writings, choose a standard representation, ordering rules, sign conventions, compression rules, so that two humans or two laboratories can compare descriptions and agree whether they are truly the same statement. This is not bureaucracy. It is what makes a language shareable. It is what makes a language capable of becoming a community rather than a private dialect. And episode 8 ended with a sharp warning that becomes the ignition of episode 9: abstract equivalence and identity of sentences. Two sentences can look different and be the same meaning. But if our equivalence notion is too loose, we might collapse two genuinely different physical behaviors into one class. Then we would be calling different worlds the same sentence. That is not a harmless philosophical error, it is an empirical failure. The equivalence relation must respect what reality distinguishes. Now we arrive at episode 9, and the simplest description of what episode 9 does is this. Episode 9 is the bridge from Platonic language to operational reality. Three new facts enter the story the moment we cross that bridge. First, finiteness and noise. In the Platonic realm, you can talk about knowing phi and its derivatives as if you had direct access. In a real universe, you infer. You measure through limited windows. You have resolution limits. You have noise. You do not access j feminita phi, you access a finite slice through a fog. So episode 9 must teach the discipline of windows. What can be reliably seen, how reliability is certified, and what it means to say we have reconstructed this derivative structure rather than we have dreamed it. Second, mapping and calibration. In the abstract, omega and k are pure letters. In reality, omega might appear as a spectral frequency, k as an interference frame spacing, curvature as focusing behavior, winding as a quantized vortex count. Episode 9 is where we build the translation dictionary carefully so we do not smuggle assumptions. The same Holophase sentence must translate consistently into temporal measurements, spatial measurements, and motion measurements. If a translation works in one projection and fails in another, it is not the universe that is inconsistent, it is our mapping. Third, operational equivalence. In the abstract, equivalence is defined by symmetry. In reality, equivalence must also respect distinguishability. Two descriptions are operationally equivalent only if every relevant experiment yields the same outcomes within controlled error. This is where the abstract equivalence class meets the reality filter. This is where HLS is tested. This is where same sentence stops being a philosophical claim and becomes a measurable statement. This is why part 1 of episode 9 matters. It places you, the listener, on the threshold, with both realms visible. And now I want to make you part of the story in a way that is both intimate and strict. Because in Holophase, the observer is not outside the language. You are a phi pattern inside phi. Your senses, your brain, your instruments, your notebooks, your choices, all are themselves Holophase sentences. The universe is a language reading itself. This makes the project personal, but it also makes it demanding. You cannot appeal to an external authority. The only authority is reproducible measurement inside the same language. Holophase must earn its status by surviving tests. So let us use a single everyday analogy that captures the entire transition. Imagine you are in a room, and behind the wall, someone is playing music. You cannot see the instrument. You cannot see the musician. You receive only vibrations. From those vibrations, you infer tempo, rhythm, and melody. But your inference is limited by noise, by the wall filtering certain frequencies, by echoes and distortions. Still, you can recognize identity. You can recognize the same song played in a different key. You can recognize a motif, even if it is stretched. You can tell the difference between two songs that share a chord progression, because deeper structure distinguishes them. Holophase is like that, but for reality. Phi is the hidden cyclic rhythm, omega is the tempo you infer, K is the spatial texture you infer from patterns and interference. V is how motifs travel. Higher derivatives are accents, dynamics, and expressive nuance. Topology is the repeating theme that cannot be removed without breaking the song. HLS is the sheet music standard that lets different musicians write the same piece in a comparable way. Equivalence classes are the deep recognition that the same song can have different notations and still be the same meaning. Let's make that even more concrete with one patch of reality you can picture right now. Because a transition should not only summarize, it should let you feel the whole language working in a single scene. Picture a still pond at sunrise. The surface is quiet, smooth, almost like a blank page. That quiet surface is like phi before differences speak, the silent root. Now a single raindrop falls. The moment it touches, the page becomes writing. circular ripples spread outward. You can hear in your imagination a gentle pulse. You can see in your imagination expanding rings. That one event is already a whole holophase sentence. Where is omega here? It is in the local rhythm. How fast the surface rises and falls at a point as the ripple passes. If you put a tiny floating leaf at one spot, omega is the tempo of its up and down motion. Where is k? It is in the spacing of the rings, how quickly the pattern changes as you move across distance. Tight rings mean larger k. Loose rings mean smaller k. And where is v? It is in the speed of the rings themselves. How fast must you move to remain on the same crest of a ripple? If you were a tiny ant skating on a leaf, v would be the rule that tells you how to stay on the same ridge of the wave. Now listen to the deeper grammar. If the pond is perfectly uniform, the rings stay smooth. But if there is a shallow region or a patch of reeds, the ripples bend and focus. That bending is curvature grammar, the shape of the slope in the phase landscape. Some regions act like lenses, others scatter. Where ripples crowd together and intensify, you feel convergence. Where they spread out and weaken, you feel divergence. If wind shears the surface, the pattern stretches sideways. If a small whirlpool forms, the pattern twists. You are watching second derivative accents, and you are watching how they change the meaning of the sentence without changing the fact that it is one sentence. Now notice topology. If there is a tiny vortex in the pond, a rotating swirl, you can walk a loop around it, and the phase-like direction of the water motion winds by an integer. That integer is not a matter of opinion. It is not erased by small disturbances. It is the discrete, countable letter hiding inside the continuous surface. That is the same topological idea that episode 6 introduced with winding and sigma, and that episode 8 purified as an intrinsic part of the language. Now notice waves and messages. Multiple ripples overlap, reinforce, cancel, and form packets. The packet carries meaning. The crest is appearance. Now notice memory. After a minute, the pond calms, but the story did not vanish completely. If the raindrop stirred silt, a faint ring of cloudiness remains. If the vortex displaced leaves, a pattern of drift persists. The system retains traces. In episode 8, we framed this as abstract memory, path dependence, persistence, hysteresis. In the physical world, it becomes literal. Scars, records, grooves, stable configurations, lingering correlations. Episode 9 will ask, how do we detect those traces reliably? And how do we separate real memory from measurement artifact? And now notice equivalence. You could describe this pond event in many ways. You could talk about rings, or about frequencies in a spectrum, or about the movement of a leaf, or about the energy spreading. Those descriptions can look different and yet refer to the same underlying process. That is the heart of when different means the same. But the equivalence must be disciplined. If two descriptions make different predictions about where the rings will focus or how fast the packet travels, then they are not equivalent sentences. They are different sentences, and reality will decide. This is the real point. By the time you reach episode 9, you are no longer just hearing a theory. You have learned a way of seeing. You can stand in front of a pond, or a vibrating guitar string, or a beam of light, or the rhythm of your own breathing, and you can ask the holophase questions. What is the local tempo? What is the spatial texture? What is the propagation rule? What are the curvature accents? Where are the knots? What persists as identity? What survives as memory? And, crucially, what could I measure that would force me to change my story? That is why this transition matters. It is a reminder that the journey was never a collection of separate lectures. It was one climb up one tree. It was one story of one thread, learning to speak as time, space, motion, identity, memory, and meaning. Episode 9 is where we stop pretending we can see the whole score directly, and we commit to the disciplined art of reconstruction. How to infer the holophase sentence from what is observable. How to decide whether two recordings are the same sentence or different. And how to falsify our claims when the data refuses our story. That is the heart of the transition. And we can already state the guiding rule of episode 9 in one line. Every claim must be anchored in a test that could fail. If phi is the universal language, we should be able to take a real system, A laser pulse in fiber, a sound wave in air, vortices in fluid, interference patterns in quantum experiments, patterns in living tissue, and extract a consistent set of derivative structures: omega, k, v, curvature, winding, and the rest. Those structures should satisfy grammar constraints like integrability and consistency. They should respect representation freedom. Changing coordinates should not change predicted outcomes. They should obey equivalence rules. Different forms that claim to be the same sentence should yield the same measurements. And then we should predict. If we change the system, the holophase description should tell us how omega, k, v, and the higher signatures respond. If reality behaves otherwise, the language must be refined, narrowed, or abandoned. That is what makes Holophase a scientific program and not a belief. So now, before we end this transition, let me gather the whole journey into one final breath, as a coherent letter you can keep. Episode 6. We met phi, learned shift symmetry, learned the first letters omega k d phi v, climbed into second derivative accents, opened topology with winding and sigma, and began translating daily life as phi sentences. Episode 7. We became literate. We learned identity as stable derivative fingerprints across time, space, and motion, learned waves and dispersion as grammar, learned balances and intensities as universal measures of change, learned the dimensional echo as the reason triunity and depth never stop, and learned to keep falsifiability alive as the spine of the program. Episode 8. We purified the language in the Platonic realm. We defined the alphabet and grammar abstractly, defined topology as intrinsic structure, defined semantics without reference, opened information, memory, and computation as structural possibilities, and then secured the language for humanity by insisting on representation freedom, equivalence classes, and a holophase language standard with canonical form, so that meaning is not trapped in personal notation. And now, episode 9. We step into embodiment. We will build the operational bridge. How to measure, infer, reconstruct, compare, standardize, and falsify holophase sentences under the real limits of noise and finiteness. We will define the reality filter that decides which abstract sentences can exist as stable, measurable phenomena. We will define how equivalence must respect operational distinguishability. We will design tests that can break the theory if it is wrong. This part 1 is the threshold. It is the breath before we climb again. So take one last look at the master tree in your mind. See phi at the root, silent and cyclic. See the first branches, omega, k, defi, v. The tri-unity of time, space, and motion, emerging as one echo. See the second layer, accents of change, curvature, and convergence. See topology threading through like knots in one thread. See the canopy fading into J infinity of phi, the infinite dictionary. And now add one more image. A human hand reaching toward the tree. Not to worship it, but to measure it. Gently, carefully, and honestly. That is where we stand. Next, we will zoom into episode 9 itself, part by part, and turn this language into a disciplined bridge between abstraction and experiment. That is where episode 9 begins. Salam and peace be upon you.